So they have a calendar at the United Nations, and there are 15 days for girls and women. 15. And there are 0 for men and boys. There's been this expectation for decades now that men will just fall in line and be good little foot soldiers and good little allies for female empowerment. But now the evidence is saying that there are these 12 areas around the world where there are disparities. And the fair thing to do is to say, we've worked for you, for your daughters, for your opportunities. And now the right and moral and just thing is to...
Before we start, I have a favor to ask. If you find these conversations worth your time, please subscribe to Perth Dialogues and hit the bell icon so you don't miss the next episode. It is free and it is the single biggest help you can give the show. Now let's get into it. Hello everyone. Welcome to Perth Dialogues, our next episode. And I'm very, very pleased to have David with us here. I've been following his work for so long, David, for men and boys. And that's a rare thing. So I thought you'll be a great person to come on and share your work and then what's going on, the new things that are going on in Australian field about men's and boys. So thank you again for giving the time.
Yeah, no, it's my pleasure, Noma, to speak with you. And we can cover that and more broadly as well. Yeah.
Yeah. Your LinkedIn profile says, the description says, you're a father, then you are a husband, then you're a non-executive director, and then a volunteer. Why that set of or series of nomenclature?
Yeah, well, being a father is just fundamental to, my life. I'm so proud to have a son and a daughter, and it changes you. Your outlook changes. You think about the future and about the world that they are growing up in, and also about, the life that they'll experience, which takes you decades into the future. Happy, proud husband. We've got a stable household and a family here for the kids, and we're both actively involved, in the community doing a range of different things. I was lucky, actually. During university, I picked up a role where I was essentially a treasurer of an environmental group, which was going back, about 30 years now. And so I was fortunate, to get an experience in boards and governance at quite a young age. And then I've been involved in almost a couple of dozen organisations during those 30 years. A lot of experience as a board member and non-executive director. I've done the AICD Company Directors course. I've done the course above that's called Boardroom Mastery. I've spent a lot of time studying governance, chairing committees, strategy, all the things that feed into the top-down governance of an organisation. And yeah, I'm proud to say I'm a volunteer. I've had a lot of roles where I volunteered. I've put time, effort, money, deep thought and commitment into organisations. And I think that spills over to my advocacy for boys and men. I think you can see in what I'm doing that I'm taking a strategic approach, and I'm trying to take learnings from the nonprofit sector, learnings from government and from my business experience into this space of advocating for boys and men.
In India, there's a saying that whatever you are, there's always a reflection of a father into the son. And you describe first as yourself as a father. So how was you as a young boy and the impression or the influence of your father into you that builds you as who you are today?
Yeah, it's really important. I mean, my dad as well and my mother have been involved in voluntary, non-profit causes for the whole time that I've been in the family. So, me and my sister, we were involved, actually. We were recruited, into, we were volunteered into helping out and turning up and being at the front lines. And, sometimes it was reluctant. sometimes we had to be dragged along. But we learnt a lot because we actually got to see with our own eyes. You see people in need, you see how you can organise and coordinate, and you see the benefits that come out of it. I mean, that's what I really like about the local board roles that I have, because we're overseeing childcare centres and aged care and transport and community services, and we get to see the clients and the beneficiaries of those services. And, I feel a close affinity and connection to that, and I care about it. So I've taken a lot. The other thing that Nirmal really goes down through that generation, my parents were missionaries. They were involved in the Uniting Church for a very long time and very active in social justice, from essentially a Christian foundation. And you can see this, in the Bible itself and in the early teachings of the church about protecting the vulnerable, widows and children. And, at that time, when I was in primary school, I was growing up with a very strong feminist mother. And a lot of the social justice activism was around equality of rights, access to education and employment. But we've really moved on. Like 30 or 40 years later, education's completely changed. Women took the majority of university students in 1987. That's 40 years ago. And now for, university completions in Australia, there are 64% more women than men. So out of every 13 graduates in Australia, 8 are female and 5 are male. And that ratio is only going in one direction. It could be within the next decade that there are 2 women graduates for every 1 male graduate. It'll just depend on how fast that ratio shifts. So I've essentially taken a social justice toolkit and applied that for boys and men, because there are lots of groups and individuals amongst males who are struggling, disadvantaged, vulnerable, and in need of support.
You talked about your social justice upbringings from your mother. Was there, apart from that, was there any particular point in your life when you thought, okay, now I have to start, now I can't sit back, now I have to start talking about or advocating for boys and men?
Well, actually, over 10 years ago, I spoke up for boys' education and men's health. I felt it was needed at that time, and there was a huge amount of pushback and a lot of skepticism. But I've been tracking education for 30 years, closely taking a keen interest in the education of Australian boys and young men. And there was a parliamentary inquiry between 2000 and 2002. And it did some fantastic work, mate. It did some really good work. They uncovered the weaknesses in boys' literacy, the weaker high school completion. They could see the disengagement. And they came up with some 24 recommendations. They pushed out a report in October 2002. It was a really good report, a fantastic report. But hardly any of those recommendations got implemented. So literacy's continued to weaken. You've got a big gap in high school completion. You've got boys disillusioned, they're not being supported, they're getting negative messages. There's still a lot of support for girls in some areas like maths and STEM and science. So there's affirmative action, but it's not based on need. There are big needs to support our boys and teenage boys and young men in education. And we're just not seeing the public policy measures, the funding, the media attention, the cultural concern. And I hear from parents and grandparents, mothers of sons who are really concerned about their boys in school education and about the paths that they're on. And I'm hearing that grassroots response, feedback, love, care, concern. but I'm not seeing that reflected in government or in media or in education or in academia.
You also said that um, a a big part of your advocacy is, and from your parents, is coming from Christian masculine stream of the movement. If you advocate on based on Christian values and things, is there a risk that because Australia is so multicultural now, that that messaging can be narrowed and people might not listen to it because they might think that it is coming from a Christian worldview and it won't match my worldview?
Oh, I think it's good. It's good observation, and it's a fair criticism. But in the book that I've just written, which is 100 of the best books for men, I draw out what I see as being the 6 waves of the men's movement, which really covers the whole period, from essentially, even the late 60s through till now. And in the Anglo countries, in the English-speaking countries, there is a wave of the men's movement that's very closely anchored in Christianity. And I was put on to the original dating of that by Warwick Marsh, who suggested Edwin Louis Cole in 1982, who wrote an incredible book called Maximised Manhood. And I think that's a fair dating for when that wave of Christian masculinity kicked off. And it's had a whole bunch of successes, including Richard Rohr. And I think it's important in the English-speaking countries, and to be honest, probably across the West, because the civilizational and cultural foundations and the legal foundations, the moral and legal and institutional foundations of the West are anchored and founded in Christianity. So I think that needs to be understood to operate within our system. And then, as well as that, you've got very significant populations of Christians, whether they are very actively practicing, whether they are more disengaged or cultural Christians than others. So I think it is important, especially in the English-speaking and the Western countries, to understand that. Take your point. The other 5 of the 6 waves that I've identified aren't nearly as tightly anchored in a Christian worldview or in faith even. Men's liberation, which mirrors women's liberation, that's much more about civil rights and equality and legal standing. The most recent wave that I refer to as agency and institutional reform, that's about bringing personal agency to men, giving them the confidence that they can take action which will have an impact in their lives. And it's also about modernizing and bringing the institutional architecture that men and boys need. We've got huge institutions for women and girls in the English-speaking countries and in the Western countries. So the other 5 waves aren't nearly, as closely tied into Christian faith or Christian worldviews. But I think it's a good point, and that's why most of my messaging and campaigning, and to be honest, most of what I see isn't. It's not closely anchored to Christianity.
Keeping on Christianity, like there's a principle that charity begins at home. So when you are starting your advocacy, what do you tell your children, your son, your daughter, your wife? What are you trying to do, and what's your messaging for them?
Yeah, well, there's clearly leadership and guidance around how to engage with other people. And something I think we haven't probably talked about enough is how children's development, family formation influences the adults that we become. And I'll give you an example of that. So I often see boys being, chastised, told off, disciplined for being too rough, being too, physical. And, to some extent, it's driven by their physiology and hormones and other things and the way that they learn. I mean, they do learn through contact and tactile experiences. But on the other hand, when girls push back or hit or kick or bite, sometimes I don't see the same type of responses from parents that I would expect if a boy had done that same thing. And I think the messaging we're sending needs to be principled and consistent around boys and girls, because we don't want to raise another generation of entitled girls and young women who believe that they can get away with anything, that they will be, excused and forgiven and not held to account. I think the direction of travel has been towards, equal treatment and equal expectations. So we need to be a bit honest about that. If girls are hurting, physical, nasty, we need to have boundaries around that and be consistent. The other thing, Nirmal, that I take pride in is getting involved in the community and helping other people. It's not just all about you and what you can take and what you might achieve or what you might do in education or your career. I mean, as you can see, I'm a volunteer. I've chosen to contribute to other causes. So I try to lead that in our family as well. We donate to the food pantry. We go out and we help our other organizations and contribute in our community. And I think that's very important because that was the role model in my family when I was growing up. And it had a very strong impact on me. And I think as parents, it's hard. I know it's hard to pay the bills. You're tired. There's only so much time and energy. But particularly as a father, we have to lead, and moral formation is an important part of parenthood.
Like when you were going through sharing the discrepancies or not, the asymmetry between the outcomes for boys and men, your work is different. You are advocating for men and boys and for better outcome for them, but it can be taken as, against feminism. Would you like to explain the difference?
Well, I mean, the vast majority of my advocacy is around recognizing the deficiencies, the gaps, the disadvantage. And a lot of the time I'm speaking up for the most vulnerable boys, the unserved men, not for, upper middle class, highly educated, wealthy men. I mean, there's the voice of disadvantaged men is very weak everywhere in the English speaking and Western countries. The voice of working class men, of low income men, of non-university educated men, it's very weak in media and in politics. And it's certainly not anything as powerful as the megaphone that female empowerment and feminism still has in the West. So I don't think there's even a conception of the male voice having anything close to a tenth of the weight that the voice for women and girls has in the Anglosphere, for example. So, for the vast majority of the advocacy that I've seen, it's about equal treatment. It's about stop discriminating against us. It's about, how do we provide education that actually meets the needs of boys? How do we honor the unique differences of boys and girls? In healthcare, for example, there is a huge disparity. In Australia, there's 6 times the amount spent on women's medical research than on men's medical research. 6 times. So it's a big difference. So you can advocate to lift the male spending. I haven't really heard advocates talk to cut the female spending, but there's a rebalance there. In suicide prevention, for example, there are programs there that have no validated outcomes. So there was recently a national audit on the health department spending in suicide prevention, covering $990 million worth of public money, of taxpayers' money. And the National Audit Office was super critical about the lack of measured outcomes for that spending. So the advocates that I hear in the space who are really passionate about reducing male suicide, they want programs that are effective. They want to see that money spent in delivery of services that make a positive difference. And I think that's just actually basic, effective use of taxpayers' money. So, mate, I'll give you another example. In the space of families, of divorce and child custody, what I'm hearing is a big concern about children's outcomes. It's a concern that children are being forcibly separated from their biological fathers, that it's being the legal system's being weaponized, and that there are false accusations that there's inappropriate advice and use of legal measures. And advocates are wanting to see better outcomes for children. I mean, we know from the social science research, the best outcomes for children have been measured in intact families where the biological mother and the biological father are caring for their children. So we've got a real disjunction going on there, and that system is not fit for purpose. It's legalistic. The lawyers are making a ton of money, a ton. And the lawyers themselves are incentivized to manufacture high conflict, to manufacture situations where you've got lawyers on one side getting paid and lawyers on the other side getting paid and the children losing. So we've got a shockingly bad system that's not fit for purpose.
You talked about a lot of disadvantage that the boys see. So I think it's a good point or a good place to talk also about your work with International Council for, men and boys. Do you want to talk about that and the 12 points or areas of disadvantage that they talk about?
Yeah. So that role, I'm a board director on the International Council for Men and Boys, ICMB, which is a Washington-based non-government organization. It's the peak body for boys and men in the world. So they have hundreds of members across more than 40 countries, and they've investigated more than 50 countries. And what they've found across the 50 countries is a consistency in disparities. And you can see this on the homepage of ICMB. It's menandboys.net. And the first one's education, which is the one that I'm super, super passionate about. And like I said, I've been following that for 30 years, particularly from an Australian perspective. But stepping onto this role as a board director for ICMB, I've been getting the international perspective, and I've been networking with my peers across many of those 40 plus countries. Number two is health. And there are some incredible disparities in health. There are 7 countries around the world where men die 10 years sooner or more. Mortality rates are an average of 40 to 50% higher for males than they are for females. And what a lot of people know is that suicide is often 3 to 4 times higher for males than it is for females. So there are huge disparities there. The number 3 is boys. And this is one that we don't think a lot about in the West. But in particular, what the ICMB talks about is the prevalence of boys being used in child labour and in hazardous work, and also that when they're in places and times of conflict, boys are often unwillingly recruited to be child soldiers. So a whole range of areas where boys are vulnerable and at serious risk of harm, which aren't adequately being addressed by the United Nations. Number 4 is false allegations and false accusations, which are mentioned in the context of family law, but they're also a big issue in education and in the frontline facing services for males, because as a male teacher or as a male nurse, you're putting yourselves in a situation where a single accusation from a female student or client could effectively take you off the floor and put you in a very compromised position. And that's not adequately being dealt with by processes and our legal system at the moment. Number 5 is victims of violence. So we very well, there's very good evidence there that males make up 80% of homicide victims, but don't get anywhere near the types of responses that female victims do. For example, male victims of domestic violence are very poorly served. In Australia, it's shocking, but there was a submission to Parliament showing that there were about 4 or 5 times more refuges for animals of domestic violence victims than there were for male victims of domestic violence, which is appalling, treatment of men in extremely vulnerable situations. Number 6 is fatherhood and the challenges that men have to remain involved and to struggle through biased legal systems. Number 7 is the criminal justice system, where there's a plethora of evidence showing that males get treated in a much more harsh way at every stage of the police, justice, criminal, prison system. So for exactly the same situation, they get harsher penalties and worse treatment than female perpetrators. Number 8 is partner abuse, domestic violence, intimate partner violence, and that's getting more attention from academics. The Routledge Handbook on Male Victimisation came out last May, which I think has 30 contributors in it. So there's quite a lot of work that's going on in that space, but that's a case of researchers and academics catching up with what has already been evident for decades. Number 9 is homelessness, where it's pretty well known across countries that about 3/4 of homeless are male and are underserved and don't get the same access to services and accommodation as females. Number 10 is workplace, and particularly in Australia, for example, there are 20 men dying in the workplace for each woman who dies in the workplace, but also men are massively overrepresented in injuries in the workplace. Number 11 is adoption and reproductive rights, where often there's a big asymmetry and difference between the treatment of males and females. And number 12 is media, and that's to do with the asymmetries in how females and males are treated in the media. There's been some incredible work there. There's a book on Missionary by Paul Nathanson and Catherine Young, which is about 25 or 26 years old, and most of their research was done in the mid to late 90s. And they found reams of evidence of stereotyping of males, of negative framing of male behaviour, including fathers and men. And it's been the case for decades, particularly in the West. And that's what I can speak to, because I can't really, sort of speak in a rich way outside of the Western countries. But those are the 12. And I think they're doing really groundbreaking work. I think they're shining a spotlight onto issues that have not been given adequate treatment, fair funding, or public policy responses.
Out of the 12, you work mostly in education. But apart from education, which one do you think is the most underappreciated?
That's a really good question. And we're actually looking at this at the moment. We're looking across the 12 and trying to gauge where the international performance is. I would probably call out victims of violence and false accusations, as two that really need a lot of work, because we've just got this asymmetry in empathy and concern. And unfortunately, it's become institutionalized in laws and in funding and in the mission statement of organizations. And it's a really hard one to push back against.
Yeah, in India, I can tell about India, not here. And there was a law that was brought in some time ago, 498A, Section 498A, in and it was basically to prevent dowry harassment to the woman. And it was being so much misused by false allegations that even the highest court in India had to say that the misuse of 498A is almost like legal terrorism. But the law is still there, everything is still there, nothing has moved. So, yeah, I can understand the emotions behind that. But
So I can tell you, in India, we have some really amazing organizations and people speaking up, and those issues do cut through. They get heard by the advocates in North America and in Europe. So we're aware. And for the International Men's Day webcast last year, they crossed to an advocate in India, and I think it's getting onto the radar. It's getting attention. But we also hear, from Latin America, from Spain, from Denmark. I mean, the power of ICMB is that it's bringing people together across countries, and we're seeing the patterns, and we're learning from each other. So I think that's really important to be doing that.
in Australian context, the number of suicides and the proportion that you said, 3 in 4, that's been stable or constant for decades now. You talked about the report that came out in early 2000s. Why do you think that report and that statistic has not moved the policy positioning of our government and laws?
So in recent years, the ratios and the numbers haven't moved massively, but what you've been seeing in recent years is a tick up in male suicide at the same time as there's been a decline in female suicide. So it went from being just under 75% to 76.5% last year. So there's a slight change there. The big change goes from, say, the 1960s, when the ratio at some times during the 50s and 60s was under 2. So for every female suicide, there were just under 2 male suicides. And that is a big jump, say from 1.8 to 3.1. That's a pretty sizable, significant jump. Some of the advocates in this space really point to the Family Law Act, the Family Court, and the various changes that act and the application of that law have had. And in particular, there are arguments that are put, and I've seen not definitive, evidence of this, but I've seen persuasive evidence of this, that the shift to no fault divorce and increasing latitude for females to leave relationships that they don't want to be in and to take the kids and the house and a whole bunch of money, that they argue that has led to a higher rate of male suicide in comparison to female suicide. And if you look at some of the charts, it's quite persuasive. that ratio really changes. You see almost a flatlining of female suicide and a constant ramping up of male suicide. And there have been some flicks backwards and forwards in the Federal Family Law Act as well. So there was some minor change. There were some minor but important changes done during the Howard coalition government, and then a reversal of some of those changes in more recent years. And there are arguments put that the default presumption of shared custody led to a reduction in the ratio of male to female suicide, but that the reinstatement and the harsher treatment of fathers and males has led to an increase in male suicide. So I think that needs to be carefully examined. I can understand the dynamics there, and I hear anecdotal stories about this on a regular basis. Really heartbreaking, incredibly distressing stories about this, and fathers being forcibly separated from their biological children. So that's the big change that I'd point to, Nirmal, is if you go back to, a period of the 50s and 60s, the ratio was about 2, and sometimes it was below 2. And then we've gone a step change up from under 2 to over 3. And I think for example, there's a book called Failure by John Stapleton, which chronicles the first 50 years of the Family Law Act and the Family Court. And it's full of critiques and case studies and examples of how this is not serving families, children, and our society. So that's not a symptom of a healthy dynamic for relationships and families and healthy society.
So we talked about the disadvantage to the men and boys, but whenever this discussion comes up in media or anywhere, it's always a counter argument that even though there is a disadvantage at the bottom, the men dominate at top. Political power, boardrooms, and you were there in the boardrooms, you are in the boardrooms. How do you square this asymmetry between power at lower levels and at higher levels?
Well, just because you have a male prime minister doesn't mean that men are lording it over. I mean, that's not the case with Anthony Albanese. It's not like he's funding men's health or changing the law to suit boys and men. It's actually the opposite. In the last 3.5 years, the law's been changed and funding has been changed to help women predominantly. There was an analysis by the Australian Men's Health Forum that looked at the first 4 budgets of Anthony Albanese's Labor government. And what it found was, of new announcements of health funding, there was 60 times more that went to women's health than to men's health. So just because you have a male prime minister or a male health minister or a male secretary of the health department, that does not mean that men are exercising power to the detriment of women. And, I think this is a fundamental misunderstanding. It's a fundamental myth about patriarchy. You can have a man in the head of government or as a king, or you can have male cabinets, but they were providing safety and stability for women and for children and for families and for quality of life. And through all of that time, this is the case in the West and around the world, all societies have been marked by male disposability. The working class men and the soldiers and the security, the men in the risky jobs, they're not privileged. They've been literally putting their bodies and their lives on the line for their families and their communities. So I think there is a fundamental myth there, and I think it's been extremely powerful, but it's not really accurate or balanced. So I think we need to challenge the narratives that have led to where we are now. And that's, something that I dealt with in my first book, The Relentless War on Masculinity. I really go back and I do question and challenge those myths. For example, I'll give you another example, which is the case throughout humanity. Based on DNA evidence, twice as many women have had children as men.
Yeah.
And consistently through history, women have had longer lifespans. I mean, there have been times when the lifespans are pretty similar, but overall, women have had longer lifespans. So if you're going to judge a good life, as a human, it's living longer and living to see your children. And twice as many females in humanity have had that. They've had the privilege of longer lives. They've had offspring, progeny, whereas quite a large minority of males did not have that. They did not live to see children, and they were putting their bodies, on the line to do arduous, risky work, and sometimes losing their lives because of that. So I don't really accept the framing of the question. For example, in Australia at the moment, the cabinet has a small majority of women. So, I think there's an interesting situation of, okay, are you going to push the education system to be even more unfavourable to boys and young men? I mean, like I said, there are already 164 female graduates for every 100 male graduates. Do you want to push it to 200 female graduates for every 100 male graduates? Is that what you're trying to do? I think we need a more granular, richer, honest assessment, not just the talking points of second wave feminism or intersectional feminism or, a social media post or comment. We need something that's a lot bigger and more inclusive than that.
So you referred to a few data points where, in spite of having a man at the top, the institutions still favor females or women in every sphere, be it the number of cabinet, the education and things. Why do you think it is that? What factors lead to the powers there be or the institutions there be to favor women and females?
So in my book, I talk extensively about gynocentrism, which is like a moral imperative to cherish and uphold girls and women. I don't say that in every area of society that females are favoured, but I do cite the areas, and they include, particularly in government and education and health and a whole bunch of other areas, media, for example, mainstream media in the Western countries. So I don't claim that every area is marked by gynocentrism or female empowerment. And I think you can see other areas, for example, there are trades and construction and a whole bunch of areas that are still, heavily male dominated, if you want to use that word, if you look at the composition of their workforces. So these are not areas of, female empowerment or gynocentrism. So I'm not claiming that every area is, but one thing that underpins all of that is a consistent asymmetry in how males and females cherish and protect and uplift girls and women. And this is covered in The Empathy Gap by Rick Bradford. He goes into this in a lot of detail, over hundreds of pages. But I think what echoes for me is that a society that cherishes their young women and protects mothers is much more likely to be self-sustaining and grow than a society that undermines or doesn't protect. Because, if you're not looking out and honouring and cherishing the bringers of new life, then fundamentally it hampers, your ability to raise children and to see the next generation. So I think there are aspects of our deep aspects of our adaptations and evolution that are marked in our the DNA and the physiology and the psychology of people, and that leads to this consistent asymmetry, right? Because women favor women and men also favor women. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
So boys and men often will go out of their way to protect or to lift up or to not just opening doors, but actually making things easier for and better for girls and women. So I think that's a consistent bias that's prevalent across cultures and across time. And I think it does have an adaptive trait of helping humans and societies to replenish and generate.
Within that overall potential gynocentrism, there has been a recent national inquiry into the education of boys. And you put your submission in. When you talk about what was the inquiry about and what were your submissions into that?
Yeah, I mentioned the last report in October 2002.
Mm-hmm.
So it's 24 years, it's essentially a quarter of a century since we've seriously looked at the education of boys and young men. So this is a very important inquiry. It's had 146 submissions. That's how many were uploaded. There might be more to come. It takes a while for the committee to deal with the submissions that have been lodged. The terms of reference are very wide. They speak about educational attainment. So it's looking at different groups of students, who's doing well, who's not doing well. I'm trying to understand why and trying to support the students who don't have, the advantages and the benefits. But, and we can see these. I mean, poorer families, Indigenous families, kids with disabilities, remote locations, in some cases non-English speaking. Non-English speaking is an interesting one because, some of those students do incredibly well. English is a second or third language. Some of them really flourish in our education system, but there are others who are struggling. So it's not the case that in general or across the board that group necessarily is struggling or vulnerable. And it's also the case with regional and rural. There are some rural students and families who manage to navigate the education system really well and get good outcomes from it. So we've had the first public hearings. I was at Parliament House last Thursday. So I heard the Department of Education, the Curriculum Authority, ACARA, and the Education Research Organisation, AERO. I heard their CEOs and senior officials speak. And what was in my mind was the parents and grandparents of boys, in school system, and who don't have a strong pathway through education. And I was hoping to hear more empathy and concern for the struggling boys. It's still a bit politicized. There's still a reluctance from the bureaucracy and government to really understand and support boys. I think there are over 1 million boys in the education system who have various disadvantages from disabilities, developmental vulnerability, their families in poverty, fatherlessness, a whole range of areas. I've mapped out 10 groups of boys who I believe are at a disadvantage. So I don't think that we need to support every boy in the education system. but I've mapped out those 10. I've shared those publicly and I've shared them with the committee members. And I think there's a strong case for calling out those 10 groups of boys as a priority equity cohort to the same level as Indigenous students and remote and regional students. The other thing that has really stood out to me in this inquiry so far, Nirmal, there's a lot of work about descriptions and trying to work out what's happening and, all of that stuff. There's not much work that's gone into what's the solution. So that's the other area that I've really been leaning into and really been trying to do the work on is what can I identify as a successful program, service, support or approach that can actually be used. One of them I'll tell you about is this terrific business in Queensland. It's run by Tanya Graham-Bauer. She's an ex-teacher. She had 20 years of experience as a teacher, and she's got 2 sons. And she started a business called Literacy for Boys. And it's this awesome online program that helps boys in school who are at risk of falling behind. And she can deliver that to schools and to students across Australia because it's online. So if it's in a remote location, if it's on the other side of the country, no problem. The program can still be applied. As a teacher, she's got an intimate understanding of the curriculum. So it's complementary to the Australian schooling curriculum. And she's had fantastic results with it. So boys who've been, behind, like a year or 2 behind in their literacy, she's been able to help them to claw that back and get back towards what's expected of their class level. So that's an example that I can give you that's really practical, low cost, and targeted, and it's tailored to the Australia circumstances, where we could be doing a lot more to help the boys who are struggling. And I think there are a good half a dozen examples like that, and I'll be sharing those with the committee members, and I'll be pushing for more of the focus to be on the potential solutions, how we can actually make a positive difference.
Yeah. So you talked about that there's not much stress on the solutions that the committee can take in. What are your solutions that you are looking to give to them? You can suggest them or you can propose them.
Yeah. Well, one of those is literacy for boys. And I was really pleased that Tanya put in a submission to the committee as well. And if you have access, I'd recommend looking up that submission too, because I think it's got real first-hand lived experience from a teacher's perspective about what can be done to lift up the literacy performance of boys in our schools. The other ones that I've mentioned, and this is public, you can see this in a post that I put up on social media 2 days ago. I've mentioned a number of other programs, the Clontarf Foundation, Backtrack, Pathways to Prevention, and also a program for dads to be more actively involved. So there are 5 programs that I've mentioned and that I'll be bringing up in conversation with committee members when I meet them in Parliament House.
So you said that the boys are already facing all these, like the 10 cohorts that you mentioned, they're already struggling in their education. And then potentially, as you said, that the school system is more geared towards the female or the girl child education for them. So it's a double barrier, So how can we support our boys to get better education apart from what Tanya is doing?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot. I agree that intentional parenting is a key part of this. And for example, me and my wife, like, we love reading. We've surrounded our kids with books from a young age. And I'm delighted that my son is a fantastic reader. So, I'd say he's reading would easily be above the expectation of children for his year level. So there's a lot you can do as a parent. I don't think for low to average income parents in a public school that they should have to fall back on tutoring or expensive resources to supplement what should be fundamental to our education system. Our kids should come out with strong literacy and numeracy and a good knowledge base and understanding of the world that they're operating in. And that's why my focus is heavily on literacy for boys and young men, because it's such a fundamental expectation of the system. Now, I think, one thing I mention in my most recent book, 100 the Best Books for Men, one thing that comes out in a number of those authors and thought leaders is about intentional parenting. It's about thoughtful, actively involved and engaging parenting. So you need to understand, what's going on and what the issues are. And you need to be able to respond to those issues in real time. So I've actually found that quite challenging. With a full-time job, it's hard to be on top of all the emails, all the activities, to turn up for all of the events at school. It's really tough. And I don't think it's ideal for both parents to have full-time demanding jobs, onerous, work or business responsibilities. I think it's even worse, actually, in a lot of cases for small business people, because a lot of that's unpaid. Like, you might do the time where you're actually serving your clients, but then there's a lot of paperwork and administration and employment and legal compliance and other things to deal with. So I think, part of that intentionality is pivoting. When you're blessed to have your own children, there are obligations and opportunities that come along with that as well. So, when my kids were born, I went down from 5 days per week to 3 days per week. And, other families will make their own choices. I know there are some families who are choosing to have a stay-at-home mum instead of, paying the extra tax and the childcare and all that sort of stuff, because they can see the value in the attachment, the stronger relationships, the emotional regulation and other aspects of children as they grow up. And I think there is a strong case, for when you've got school-aged children, I think there's a strong case for not having hugely onerous jobs. I mean, if you're the CEO and you're on call at any time of the day, it's pretty hard to also be there for your children at any time of the day. So, there's an aspect here about choices and about priorities. I think we also need to inform ourselves. So, we've had lots of conversations with all sorts of staff and other parents and other kids, and we'd like to understand what's going on. I've done a whole bunch of independent research, reading, online, gathering information, talking with people in other countries, talking with teachers in other states, because I want to understand the rich environment that my kids are within and that they're growing up through. So I think that's a big thing there, Noel. I hear from teachers and they are struggling too, because they're bearing the consequences of some inadequate parenting, to be honest. Kids who don't have the boundaries and the respect and who are pushing back. There's another book that I highly recommend. I mention it in the final chapter of 100 the Best Books for Men. It's by Leonard Sachs, and it's called The Collapse of Parenting. It's from 10 years ago. It's from 2016. And his core thesis is that parents have been a bit delinquent, that we've given kids too much autonomy. We've given them this delusion of making the decisions and too many choices. And we've allowed them to, be influenced by their peers and engage with digital devices and platforms and games and other things to too much, a too greater extent. And his argument is about re-engaging, and it's about being the authority figure of your family and leading your family and re-establishing respect for parents and elders. I think there's a strong vein of truth in that over that 10 to 15 year period.
One of the other things that we initially talked was about the importance of fathers in the family. One of the features that I've seen in Australian school education is the shrinking of the proportion of male teachers in the school. What's your view on that?
In primary school, I believe we need to significantly lift male teachers. It's under 18%, so less than 1 in 5. In secondary schools, it is higher. So there are more male teachers, more positive male role models. That's connected to family stability and fatherlessness. So there are almost 1 million children in Australia growing up in homes that don't have an actively involved father. And that's a loss for the children, but it's also a loss for those fathers. I mean, there's a complementarity between mothers and fathers, between masculinity and femininity. And boys and girls both need that. They both get something unique from fathers and from mothers. So unfortunately, we've lost that honouring of the male and the female. And particularly this attempt to diminish the differences or to bring down the status of fatherhood and motherhood, I think those are really they're antisocial. If you're thinking about what's in the best interest of the children, it's intact families with biological mother and biological father. And the biggest impact of that, the biggest harm from not having that, is in disadvantaged communities, including Indigenous and Black American. So you've got these upper middle class, in some cases elites, and in some cases hold themselves out as thought leaders, saying that marriage isn't important anymore and we respect all different types of families and it doesn't matter whether kids are growing up in two mothers or a single parent household. But then you look at their own circumstances and invariably the heteronormative married with a man and a woman raising their kids. So they're preaching one thing about, every family being the same, but in their own circumstances, they're doing something quite different. And this is the same. You see this in both Labor, Green and coalition members of Parliament, talking about how they support the public education system, but then you ask them where their own children are and they've got their own children in Catholic system or in independent schools or in private schools. So, yeah, I'm really concerned about the reduction in male teachers and positive male role models, mentors, coaches, community leaders. I mean, boys and girls need to see men and women in positive roles. And particularly for a boy growing up in a single mother household where there's a lack of, healthy masculinity and mature manhood, he really needs to see that. I mean, I hear stories all the time about how kids are flocking to male teachers in the playground and at schools, and that the male teachers are incredibly popular and that they're in demand. And, I know some schools have more than 18% in primary school and they're doing well on that. I'm concerned about some men being put off education particularly that issue of false allegations. A single allegation from a female student or female staff member could be really detrimental to the career of a male teacher. We have to deal with that. We need a much better response and way of handling and triaging those claims.
You talked about the need of male teachers in the school, and we've talked about all the issues around children education. So say if there is a father or a family listening to this or listening to you now, and they have a son, say 14, 15-year-old son, who has all those disadvantages, is not getting the support from the school. So he's probably locked out of school, locked out of family. He's into his own small bubble. What suggestion would you give to that parent or the father or the mothers, how they can reconnect back to that child and bring them back into the mainstream?
Yeah, well, I can't speak from first-hand experience because my children are younger than that. But I would encourage both the parents to remain actively involved and available, to engage with the school, to talk with other parents, to do their own research, and to try a range of different, strategies. And also, just to understand some of the fundamentals about what's going on for boys, for teenage boys, and for young men. They're going through a time of puberty and changes and hormones and other things, and that's okay. Like, that's how boys transition. For fathers in particular, I think, for preteen, teen, and young men, my view is they need to carefully think about how they're going to help initiate their boys into mature manhood. And I think they need, one way you can look at that is in terms of rites of passage, in terms of marking those times of, when they start high school, when they're going through puberty, when they get towards the last couple of years, when they're choosing their subjects, when they finish high school, when they turn 18, when they get their first job. Like, how are you going to mark that and make it special for him as a boy or as a young man? So that there's, so that he's engaged and he sees that there's some meaning and purpose behind this bigger picture of what he's doing with his life, and to keep it positive and to talk about good outcomes and hopeful ways of talking about the future. So there's a lot we can do. I think one of the images that I've had, which is quite strong on me, is the need to help young boys walk across that really precarious, the bridge of adolescence, like to get to the other side. And of course, they're going to have mishaps and slips and things that don't go as expected. And that's where the boy needs to have his father and other loving elder men in that circle, ready to pick him up or to give him some encouragement or to have a chat. He might not always want to chat to his mom and dad. He might want to chat to an uncle, to a family friend, to someone in your religious community or, someone that you've known for a long time. And that's okay. It's hard to admit some things. Sometimes there's stigma or shame, and sometimes there's disappointment and there's judgment. And so it is important, I think, for boys and young men to have that group of loving elder men who are there and around and ready, and who'll mark it and make it special as those rights get achieved and passed. And also, it's okay to make different choices. Like, for boys, perhaps they're not ready to go to university. Perhaps they need an extra year or two to grow up. So a gap year might be ideal. Maybe they need to work for a couple of years and find out about the realities of the world of work. Maybe they need to use their hands. That's okay. Male psychology is different to female psychology. And we can honor both at the same time. And it's okay. and you'll get through this. Stay optimistic.
We talked about the boys. Let's talk about men. In the last year, 2 years, the the federal government has appointed a special envoy for men's health. There is a shadow envoy for men's and boys. I think everything in almost every state as well. But we don't get to hear about what they are doing. So there's obviously this question whether these appointments are symbolism or there is a wind of change going on in the government.
It's a slow wind of change. It's taking too long. So every quarter, I put together a report that looks around the different countries, and I look for the wins and achievements. And there's certainly a wave. There's a movement there that's going on, but it's just far too slow. It's good to have these positions and these appointments. There was a press conference 2 days ago, and I saw the transcript. I didn't see it live, but there were some really good responses there. Gradually I'm seeing better coverage in the media in North America and the UK. I've had some articles on boys' education, on International Men's Day, on other topics. It's slowly chipping away, but I think government and media and education are still catching up with where ordinary people have got to. And it takes time to convince them. And I think we just need to keep chipping away. We've got to organise. We've got to coordinate. We've got to have strength in numbers. We need to be making phone calls and sending emails and having conversations and writing letters and putting comments on stories and all that sort of stuff. It all adds up. And I'm just seeing this growing number of people who are aware and speaking up. And I think that's healthy, but it's just taking time.
You've written about saving 250,000 lives. Where does that number come from? And what are you looking to achieve?
I think that was in the context of suicide reduction.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And particularly, I think that was in reference to the Anglo countries. And, the US, for example, their suicide statistics are worse than here. The ratio is 4 men for every 1 woman. And so if you could bring that ratio down, that alone would be tens of thousands of lives saved per year. That gives you an idea of the scale. So I think it was across the 5 big English-speaking countries, I think it was about 60,000 males lost to suicide each year. So these are big numbers. Like, think of the number of families and communities and workplaces and everything else that's impacted by tens of thousands of male suicides each year. So making a change to that would be a tremendously positive social impact. And yeah, how do we provide genuine suicide prevention that reaches men where they are, that's meaningful to them? That would be transformational.
In your experience, what are the reasons why there is such high suicide numbers in males compared to females? And why are not men seeking help in the first place?
Yeah, when you look at the causes, there are a range of different causes. And one of the differences between males and females that I think is important is that situational distress, I think, is particularly important as a driver of male suicide. Where you've got a guy who's run out of options, who's been defeated by, the legal system, who's, had a business failure and mortgage foreclosure and a whole bunch of other stuff. He just cannot see a way out. Unfortunately, in that situation, males can turn to a terrible a terrible outcome to end that. I don't think that mental health presents in the same way. I think there are marked differences between male psychology and female psychology. And I think our framing of suicide and suicide prevention has been too influenced by a feminized approach to psychology, which doesn't really speak to men where they are or the circumstances that they're facing. And to genuinely deal with the drivers of male suicide, I think we need a different framing, which is a framing that comes from a male perspective on psychology and male circumstances. That's one thing. I think there are some misconceptions about help seeking. I've seen a range of evidence that middle-aged men have sought help, that men often do go to doctors, that men are attentive to their health needs, but also in a way that's slightly framed within male psychology. There are benefits to having stoicism. There are benefits to toughing it out sometimes. And just because you might not go to the doctor at the first possible chance, or, the other aspect of this, Nirmal, is if you're working business hours, it's harder to engage with our healthcare system. So have we designed healthcare and service delivery in a way that's accessible for most males where they are? And, there's another aspect of this, which is around communication, engagement, and stigma and other things. Think about the analogy of males working with their hands side by side, on the tools, at the men's shed, building something together, or exercising together. I had some of the best conversations as a father of young children when I was out riding my bike with other fathers. And we weren't looking each other in the eye and sitting across a coffee table or sitting across a psychologist's desk. We were actually focusing on the road and looking out to the distance, and we had something else that was going on. But we still had these incredible conversations, and we shared our experiences, and we unburdened ourselves, and we found some interesting alternative, perspectives during those conversations. I think our models of mental health care are not framed in terms of what men are likely to engage with or want to engage with. I hear this all the time, that classic therapy is not meeting the needs of males. It meets the needs of some, but not all. And so I think about in Finland, when they seriously engaged with this issue of male suicide, they spent a year looking at every single case. And then they had a response that was incorporated civil society and, employers associations and religious and sporting organizations. They went out and met men where they actually were. They weren't judgy. They weren't, they weren't saying that masculinity is toxic, or that all men, harm all women. They were actually empathetic and caring and really reaching out with, a non-judgmental perspective. So I think we often misinterpret help seeking. And I don't think we should expect men to reach out in the same way that women reach out, because men aren't women. Men and women are different. And I think as mates, we also need to step up. If you know that one of your mates or a relative or a friend, if he's gone through a difficult time in a relationship, separation, business, lost his job, got challenges in his life, I think we need to step up for our mates and actually say, how about we go, have a fish? How about we go watch some footy? How about we go have a coffee? Why don't we have a beer? Let's have a chat. How would you like to, go out and do something fun, like the old days, I think we actually just need to step up in some ways, because we can't expect government and doctors and psychologists to deal with this. It's deeper and it's much more complicated than that. And if you're on the workplace, actually the male-dominated industries are heavily overrepresented in male suicide statistics. So, there's an added layer of nuance and obligation, I think, for workplaces and bosses and colleagues in those industries to be keeping an eye on each other and looking out and just offering and starting conversations and making an effort, even when it's awkward, especially when it's awkward. That's when we need to reach out and say, how you doing? You might not even say, do you want to talk? You might just say, how about we go and do something fun or different? And then when you're in that activity, then the conversation might start, because they'll feel more comfortable and safer around, disclosing. They won't feel the same sort of stigma as me and you looking at each other across the desk and me interrogating you. Are you okay? Do you want to talk? I think we need to, like I said, channel the male psychology. There's a lot of research. There's a lot of wisdom that we're not using at the moment in workplaces and in service delivery, and we need to use that.
So we have just started those slow, winds of change by putting those envoys. On the other hand, 33% to half of the population is foreign born, where the cultural norms are as such that even there's no thinking of mental health. There is no that concept of mental health. And even if there is, the men will not come out and say, I've got a need for mental health because I've got all this load to set my family in Australia because I'm migrating. So I have to do this. I can't get into mental health. How can we reach to those cohort of men? Because one, there is no conversation, there's no concept, and then there's going to be no conversation.
It's a really excellent question, Emma. And I have to admit, I'm not an expert in that. I think there's some aspects of what I just mentioned that are relevant, and this still relates to male relatives, friends, work colleagues and others. But the added layers of cultural difference, that's an extra nuance. I think we will need to draw from knowledge across many countries, and there'll probably be a place for rigorous academic research here, in some cases. That field of male psychology, and also I mentioned the Routledge Handbook on Male Victimization, that is reaching across countries, across dozens of countries, and it does include India, some Asian countries, some Latin American countries, and Eastern Europe and other places too. So we are, getting a better understanding of those differences and the nuances. But it's an excellent question. I think there's more work to do, and the International Council for Men and Boys has a role there about being a facilitator, and we hope to prompt the UN and national governments and universities and other organizations to come along on this journey with us.
We talked about the 12 disparate areas of disparity. What changes are you looking to get through ICMB with internationally?
Yeah, so there is a level of engagement which is international, multilateral, global. Part of that is directly to the UN. So we've got board members and staff who are advocating and campaigning with the UN. One of the things that I'm really passionate about is getting United Nations formal recognition of International Men's Day. So they have a calendar at the United Nations, and there are 15 days for girls and women. All sorts of different aspects of, education and quality of life and health and other things. 15. And there are 0 for men and boys. But if you go back to the Charter, the Human Rights Declaration, it's all about equality. It's about the dignity of every person and that we all have value and that we all have equal rights. So the United Nations itself is not fulfilling its own charter and the Human Rights Declaration. So we're calling them out. And I think there's a symbolism there to making a recognition and including International Men's Day, the 19th of November, on the formal UN calendar. But then that would flow down to the member states and the organizations and the governments and the businesses and others. So I did some work last year and found that over 110 countries around the world celebrated and marked International Men's Day on the 19th of November 2025. The previous estimate had been about 80 countries. And this was done, 10 or 15 years ago. I think International Men's Day is growing. It's broadening. More people are aware of it. And in the UK, for example, 800 organisations held events and activities around International Men's Day last year. So that shows what can be achieved by having this symbolic day of celebrating and bringing attention and awareness to the issues. There are other aspects. For example, better reporting from the UN itself. We want to see sex disaggregated reporting. So a lot of the focus of the international efforts on gender equality have been around women and girls. And it's important and it's worthy and it has to be done. There are still countries where girls lag in education. In the West, that's not the case. For the most part, it's boys who are lagging now. There are countries where healthcare is not where it should be. There are countries where there are unequal rights between males and females. That work still needs to be done. But at the same time, we can walk and chew gum. But there's plenty of countries where, like I said, there are 7 countries around the world where men die 10 or more years earlier than women. Well, surely that deserves some effort, right? Surely those men are worthy and have equal dignity, and we should be paying attention to the quality of their lives. And like I said, across the 12 disparities, we've looked at 50 countries. So these are patterns of disparities that are recurring across 1/4 of the countries around the world, and we believe much more widely than that. Then we have obviously engagement from the International Council for Men and Boys with national governments. So an example is I'm a board member and I was at the Australian Parliament inquiry last Thursday. There's an annual delegation that goes to Washington, D.C., to the Capitol building, where a delegation of advocates for men and boys speak with members of Congress in November each year, and in other countries as well. And what we're doing is we're trying to coordinate across countries and within countries. So we're trying to bring together the advocates within each country to work together and collaborate. And we're also trying to bring the advocates together globally who are passionate on education and health and boys and false allegations and all of the 12 disparities. So we want to be a catalyst and we want to be a hub to bring people together, to scale efforts and to take the most successful advocacy, campaigning, and policy ideas to spread those across other countries.
We talked about boys and men. What about females? What role do you think the women and females in our society, in family, in workplace, what can they do to, help the boys and men in our lives?
So I've been an ally for women and for females. And obviously, as a father of a daughter, I'm her champion, her primary male role model. What we need to do now is recruit females and women as allies of boys and men. And I think where that comes very naturally is mothers of sons. And I can tell you firsthand that my book that was released last year, this one, The Relentless War on Masculinity, some of the biggest supporters of that are mothers of teenage boys and young men, because they've seen this firsthand. They've seen how boys are denigrated and discriminated against, and how they're not getting the same opportunities as girls and young women. And so I've had numerous mothers of sons come and say, thank you for doing this. And when I have those conversations, I say, please be an advocate to speak up for your son. Ask the questions at school. Prompt them around extra support for boys' literacy. What are they doing about writing? How are they helping the boys with their writing and their expression? How can they get more male teachers in primary school? So I've been trying to prompt mothers and fathers, but particularly mothers, to start speaking up for their sons, because I think it's really powerful. When a mum, speaks up in front of a group of parents and teachers and administrators, I think it's really powerful. It sends a strong signal to the school and more broadly to government and to the education system and others that we care and we're watching and we want something better to be done. We want to fill in the gaps. We want to be part of the solution, and we want to work together to get better outcomes. So I think that's the big one, Nirmal. There's been this expectation for decades now that men will just fall in line and be good little foot soldiers and good little allies for female empowerment. But now the evidence is saying that there are these 12 areas around the world where there are disparities. And the fair thing to do is to say, we've worked for you, for your daughters, for your opportunities. And now the right and moral and just thing is to recruit women of goodwill to work together with men of goodwill to make a positive difference.
Towards conclusion, if someone is listening to this conversation, what's one thing that you can suggest that they can take from this conversation and start implementing in their family, their life, their workplace, at dinner tables, any conversation?
So I'll give you two ideas. The first one, let's change the narrative. Like, we can't keep dumping on boys and men. Society is made up of males and females. A society doesn't succeed by denigrating and criticizing and discriminating half of the population. So let's start talking positively about boys and men. That's why I started celebrating masculinity. And you can follow that at Substack and Facebook and Twitter and other places too. So look up Celebrating Masculinity. And I bring a whole range of positive, messaging and stories and narratives around boys and men. The other thing is, speak up. Like at work, at school, speak up with your friends, particularly, if it's for women, with your female friends. Actually speak up and say, I don't want you talking negatively about all men, because they're not all, bad or evil. Like, I want us to be, fair and to actually cherish the important men in our lives, and we need to work together. More and more people are speaking up, and the power of this is, for every person who speaks up, it makes it easier and more likely for 10 or 100 more people to speak up. So particularly the early, you might suffer some pushback if you're early, but you'll have a bigger impact. And you'll make a bigger difference by speaking up early. Probably there are 5 or 10 or 100 other people in the audience thinking and feeling the same things that you're thinking and feeling. And most of them are probably going to feel a bit reluctant to speak up. Speak up anyway. Say it. Be honest. And, by being positive and speaking up, working together, we are part of a huge movement of sensible people of goodwill, and we're going to make a big positive difference.
On that note, we can conclude. But before we finish, where can people find you and your work and ICMB?
Yeah, so ICMB, you can find at menandboys.net, or you can search for International Council for Men and Boys. And they've got great resources there. Connect to them. There's contact details. There's a whole bunch. There's press releases, a whole bunch of good content. There's some really interesting videos as well. ICMB podcast at YouTube. You can follow Celebrating Masculinity, like I said, at Substack, at Facebook, Twitter, and you can connect with me. I'm on LinkedIn, and you can also look me up on Twitter. I'm connected to, I've got 20,000 plus connections on LinkedIn. A very rich network of people around the world. I love engaging with people, let's do this together. And thank you so much for having a really thoughtful approach to this, Nirmal. And
thank you, David, for giving the time that you've given and sharing your work and experiences, and hopefully for a positive, better world for the men and boys and everyone.
Absolutely, mate.
Thank you. Thank you so much for watching this episode till the end. Can you please subscribe to the channel if you have not done yet? Also, tell me in the comments what you liked in the episode. And 3, please share this episode with someone who you think will benefit from the conversation. And I'll see you the next time.